Welcome back. The last time we saw that we have these three tests which do a basic job of testing the API, and we said we're going to improve the code. One of the first things that we're going to do is we're going to reduce all the code repetition that we have here. Now we build the spec and we make those calls, we do some extractions, we do a lot of things here which we are repeating all over the tests. What we want to do is we want to reduce this repetition of code, and in order to do that we are going to create an API client, a Gist API client that's going to interact with the Gist API. It will have all the information it needs in order to do that, and our tests do not need to know how to actually call this API. They do not need to know how to build this spec builder. They do not need to know what endpoints are to be called. So they are going to have no knowledge of how the API works. That knowledge is going to be given to an API client that we're going to create, and we're going to use that API client in our tests. So I'm going to show you how this is going to look like. So these are our three tests, and this is the Gist API client that we're going to create. We're going to have some methods called create gist, delete gists, and get user gists, and this API client is then going to interact with the GitHub Gist API, and then we are going to completely remove all the Gist interaction code from these tests and put it all into this client. This client will encapsulate the code. What you then get is one class that's going to do all the interaction with this API. If something changes in the way the API behaves, the next version of the API has some differences. All you need to do is you need to change this code, and the rest of the tests will perhaps work as is. Code becomes more maintainable and more reusable. In the next set, we're going to see this in action. Let's get started with creating the Gist API client. So here we're going to create a new package, call it org.client. In this package, we're going to create a new Java class and we'll call it Gist API client. We're going to take this token and going to paste it in the Gist API client. The client now knows this, and our test doesn't need to know it anymore. We can comment it out here, but that would mean that the rest of the tests will fail. So for now, we're going to leave it out. Now, what is this test doing? It's getting a list of Gist for users. So all of this code can actually now be moved here to a new function, public get users Gist IDs. We're going to pass it a username, and in this we are going to use this username here, which we will use the username here. This thing is giving me an error because I haven't told it what the return type is. Now we can do two things. We could have said we return the complete response back and then let the code, the test that is calling it, handle it. Or in this case, we're just going to give it the IDs back. So we're going to extract the IDs of all the gists that we receive. We're going to pass it back to our tests. The reason why we're making this choice is that in the current state of our tests, all we need are the IDs that we get back from the list of gists for a user. And that is how I also named it here. So we are going to get a list of strings back. We need to import the class. List is from java.util, but at this stage we are not returning anything back. We're going to do an extract and dot path ID, and we're going to call it return. To test it out, the first thing that we can do is we're going to remove all of this code. For now, we'll comment it out. In this test class, we are going to say Gist API client. Gist API client is new Gist API client. We instantiate an object of the API client, and in the test here, we simply call the Gist API client dot get user Gist IDs, and we pass it the username errorlogsblog. That's our test user here, and all this is going to do is exactly the same thing that we were doing in the test. But now this test has no knowledge of how the API is interacted with. All it needs to know is this method for the client, and the client now does all the heavy lifting for talking to the gist API. So now we can run this test here and see how that works. And the test is passing. So now our test is doing the same thing, but instead of actually knowing all the intricacies of the API, it just knows what test user it's going to use, and it's just going to use the API client's method here. In the next step, we're going to add 2 new methods to the API client, that is for creating a gist and for deleting a gist. And that's what we're going to do in the next part.